you get when you get the Player's Handbook. The Player's Handbook is the first thing you should buy to play fully engaged, you know, base level Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition. There are starter sets out there, and they are good. They are around the $20 MSRP, so if you would prefer to spend a $20 investment into this game rather than a $50 investment into the game, that might be a better place to start. But really, if you're sure you want to play, you're going to eventually need a Player's Handbook, so I'd recommend getting a Player's Handbook. But what do you actually get when you get a Player's Handbook? Well, Player's Handbook is a weird title. It really doesn't cover the breadth of information that's covered within this book. I would really describe this book as more of the rule book than a player's handbook, because it's just as useful for dungeon masters as it is for players. And in fact, if you're looking to start your own game and be the dungeon master, you're still going to need, a player's handbook. So what do you get? Well, of course, you have an introduction, and you're going to have some general rules, but pretty much the very first thing that it tells you about in the Player's Handbook is how to create a character. And that kind of goes along with the theory of the best way to describe Dungeons and Dragons is to look at the rules of making a character, and through that lens kind of understand what the game's about and what you can do, because that's the way most players will be interacting through the games with a player character. So with that in mind, it starts talking about stats, experience points, or ability scores, right, and experience points, and then we jump into races. Now the races in the book that the Player's Handbook comes standard with are, in alphabetical order, Dwarf, Elf, Halfling, Human, Dragonborn, Gnome, Half-Elf, Half-Orc, and Tiefling. Now those races are by no means the extent of all the different player races you can create characters with in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but they are a good starting smattering of characters. And it'll also show you in the book, like, hey, these are all common characters, and here are some less common races that might or might not be in your DM's world. And those less common start out at, Gnome, and half-elf, half-orc, and tieflings. The half races are interesting because, it's interesting to be like half human, half elf, but it also gets into like why are there half elves but there aren't half dwarfs and half tieflings or half everything, right? Half humans, I don't know. But once you've kind of gotten through all those starting races, it also has all the classes for D&D. Now, no book has added classes to the game. The classes in the Player's Handbook are the classes available in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, but each class has options you can take, right? Archetypes that are called different things for different classes. Like for bards, it's different colleges, or for warlocks, it's different packs, P-A-C-T-S, packs, because of the different deals you can make with dark entities as a warlock, right? So while other books that have been released by Wizards of the Coast have more options for archetypes, the classes in the PHB are the classes that you're going to be able to play with. Of course, the beauty of D&D is you can really add your own stuff into the game and really kind of create your own world. So there's nothing saying you can't make your own classes, which is a very fun process, but I would, of course, recommend knowing and understanding the given classes so that you kind of know what is expected to make. The classes are Barbarian, Bard, Cleric, Druid, Fighter, Monk, Paladin, Ranger, Rogue, Sorcerer, Warlock, and Wizard. As you can see, there's no shortage of classes, right? There are a lot of options. You got your combat focused, your sneak focused, your magic focused, but there's also combinations in between, right? You know, there's some ones who are both combat and magic. There are things that are magic, but a different kind of magic. There are some classes are sneak with a little magic, like ranger. A lot of people don't think of it, but rangers actually are spellcasters, and they can, you know, uh, participate very meaningfully in that way. And if you want to just make a straight archer with no magic, you're almost better making a fighter who specializes in archery. So there's a lot of gray area between these classes and a lot of different ways the options kind of act and combine with one another. And of course, there's the option, which is later described in here, the rules for multiclassing. And what multiclassing refers to is taking a number of levels of one class and then switching into a different class and taking a number of levels in that class, affording you the benefits of both. And so the options are really limitless when it comes to classes. You can play hundreds and hundreds of hours of D&D and still have classes that you've not touched. But the Player's Handbook, this, not too big book, contains the rules for all those classes and multi-classing. The next section after classes is called Personality and Background. And that one's interesting because it talks about more details about your character, like their height and weight, and other like small aspects of a character that you might not normally think about. But it also introduces backgrounds, which is a unique thing to 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. And backgrounds have been pretty much universally received as a great introduction into the game. Because what they essentially do is give your character skill boosts, essentially, right? So proficiencies in certain skills based on what they've done as a vocation, as a job, up until becoming an adventurer. So if like sailor is an awesome background, right? Well, if I'm a human fighter, okay, you're a human fighter. If I'm a human fighter sailor with a sailor background, that does give you a lot more characterization of your character. Suddenly your mind is evoking images of cutlasses and pirates and fighting on the decks of ships, rather than human fighter sounds like, a generic warrior or a knight or something, right? Backgrounds are awesome, and there are a number of different backgrounds in this book. In fact, so you are aware of the backgrounds that come in the Player's Handbook. Let's see. Those are acolyte, charlatan, criminal, entertainer, folk hero, guild artisan, hermit, outlander, noble, sage, sailor, soldier, and urchin, like a street urchin. This section also talks about languages, which is a very interesting part of D&D. The idea that, similar to our life, there are a bunch of different languages on the continent of whatever continent your characters are playing in Dungeons & Dragons. And of course there are going to be, language barriers. You have to learn more languages to be able to speak with more people. If only learning languages in real life were as easy as it was in Dungeons & Dragons, right? Pretty much, like, if you make a character, it's very easy for them to be bilingual, at the very least. And if you, as in the world, it's a lot harder. Equipment is the next section, and equipment is your bread and butter, all the items that are defined in the game, save the very important exception of magic items. Magic items can be found in the Dungeon Master's Guide, which I'll do a separate video on. But the equipment section has, how much stuff costs when you go to a store. It has a bunch of everyday items as well as your weapons and your armor. So you get suited up, you got the right armor, you got the right weapons, you got your arrows, you got your bow. You also might want to pick up some of these, mundane type of items, like some clothes, right? A bedroll. You might need pythons, which are used in climbing, like rock climbing, jugs, pitchers, mess kits, hourglass. You're like, what's useful about an hourglass? Why would I want an hourglass? Well, if you are separating, your group is separating, and you are like, hey, we're going to send some people into the dungeon, and but you want to be like, hey, if I'm not back in an hour, come get me. That's how you do it, with an hourglass, because there's no watches. Um, the next section after that is a customizing options section of the player's handbook. This one is really cool. It does talk about multi-classing here, but it also describes the feats. Feats are something that were brought in from older editions of D&D, and they essentially kind of allow for more more characterization, especially combat-wise. Usually, feats have to do with one way your character is special than other characters. They've obtained this feat, and therefore they are good at XYZ. Usually has to do with combat. Of course, there are non-combat feats though, but there are stuff like, grappler, so you're better at like grappling people and wrestling, right, or stuff like that. Feats are an optional rule, but they're fun, and I would recommend using them. Maybe if it's your very first game, skip them, but other than that, you're good to go. There's a section about using ability scores, and then really just about playing the game in general. What it's like when you're traveling, what it's like when you're in the dungeon exploring, and how light affects it, how resting affects it, what happens when you get tired. Then you come to the big chapter of combat. Combat is its own chapter. As in the previous video I've stated, D&D has a very big fascination with combat. I believe this is a legacy from war games that D&D is descended from, as it is objectively a bit weird when you say, oh, I want to convince this guy of something. Okay, well, that's one dice roll. And then I want to fight that guy. Okay, that's going to be at minimum, 15 dice rolls or something when you count them all up. Combat does take a lot of time. Combat is more in-depth than the other mechanics of D&D. But that's because it is fun. And if you have ever enjoyed a video game, that's a fantasy battle video game, then you're going to enjoy the combat aspect of D&D, because there's a bajillion options, bajillion different weapons. They do different damage types and different damage amounts, and different enemies are uniquely vulnerable to certain things. So, of course, combat is fun and is a big part of it. And the stories that D&D try to evoke are combat heavy. If you think about any of these ancient myths or any kind of like Lord of the Rings movie, all of these kind of fantasy epics have warfare and combat built into them as part of the tale, because you're delving into dangerous dungeons and battling deadly monsters. So after combat section, you'll get a section about spellcasting. Spellcasting, just like combat, is very complex. And of course there is some crossover because a lot of spells are combat related, but a lot of spells aren't and are really more problem-solving abilities, right? Feather fall, that's you fall at the rate of a feather. You go very slowly. So if you're jumping, you're being chased by a monster, there's a cliff, and you're like, there's nowhere else to go. You're like, let's jump, I'll cast Featherfall. And then, boom, you guys are floating down like frickin' Mary Poppins, and the monster is like up at the top of the cliff not knowing what to do. So there are a lot of spells. The way D&D does spells, they prescribe a list of spells that exist and that your characters can learn and use, barring their race, class, or not race, but barring their class and other factors. It's not to worry though, because there are a lot of spells. There are a lot of spells in this base book, and there are even more spells in other books released by Wizards of the Coast. So in this world, magic is very much something that is definable and quantifiable, and it's taken very much to the level of like a science of saying where the area of effect is this exact square area. The duration is this exact amount. It can do XYZ specifically. If it does, it can't do this specifically, so on and so forth. So magic is very well described, and there are rules in the Dungeon Master's Guide for creating your own spells if that's something you're interested in. But the way they go about tackling this massive amount of spells is by having the spell section of this book, the Player's Handbook, divided into two sections. The first being just a list of all the different spells, kind of like this, right? And then the second being an A to Z description of all the different spells. So unfortunately, you will be doing some flipping between pages because you will say, okay, well, I can get a first level spell from this list. Okay, well, maybe I want this or this. Oh, what does that do? Well, then you'll have to kind of turn, look it up, alphabetically and say, okay, this is what it does. Okay, let me flip back. So it is a bit cumbersome, but if you get their like paid app thing, Wizards of the Coast's app, it makes this spell stuff very much more manageable. Still, old school book style, I find just to be the most, fun anyway. So, and it's not that big of a deal. And there are a lot of spells. I'm still just flipping through spells here. Spells. Alrighty. So, now, that's, you get to the end of the book and there are the appendices, right? The different appendixes. These are also very useful. I found that as a DM, oftentimes where I'm flipping to in the player's handbook is in the spell section and in the appendix. Those are pretty much, sometimes obviously the equipment, but usually this is the stuff that I find myself referencing the most. Stuff like conditions, what happens when your character gets a condition and the specific rules under there. It also does some nice light world building in the back, which is nice, where it talks about the different gods of the different settings. It talks about the different realms and planar travel, all of which, gods and the different realms and all that are talked about more in depth in the Dungeon Master's Guide. But, like I said, if you're just getting one book, this book has a nice beginner's amount about those so that you can get started as a prospective DM. And then it even has some base creature statistics, so you can kind of see what the stats of a creature look like. And then, maybe you can't get the Dungeon Master's Guide, the Monster Manual right away, but you have some starter creatures. Obviously, they're expanded on greatly in the Monster Manual, which will give you a much wider list of monsters to use. And then finally, you get a big list of inspirational reading, which I think is cool. So some books to check out if you want to be inspired for your D&D game. And then a character sheet in the back that you can photocopy. You can also just download the PDF for free online. So, boom. That's what you get when you get a player's handbook.